Welcome to our event, Leave No Issue Behind, organized by the Association for the Rights of Children in Southeast Asia and the International Alliance of Inhabitants. So this will be a discussion on the SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, and their relation to street-connected children, evictions, and homelessness. So before we start the program, we would like to share a short video with you regarding this topic. Thank you.
More than halfway into the road to our Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, and it looks like even the most important issues remain left behind. There is a strong link between eviction, homelessness, and the conditions of street-connected children, arguably some of the most vulnerable beings on the planet. The homeless, housing insecure, and other marginalized citizens in our urban areas seek to rectify a situation that has long been neglected. Unabated evictions threaten their neighborhoods. They have families, children who can already be seen spending most of their days on our streets. With rampant evictions, how long before more of the city's most vulnerable are permanently on the streets? Our SDG 11 for Sustainable Cities and Communities was conceived to reverse this trend. However, some key factors remain insufficiently discussed and linger outside the mainstream discourse. Target 11.7 touts the importance of public spaces. However, by excluding street-connected children and evictions from the narrative of the policy, it fails to uphold the access and rights to the city of the heavily marginalized. SDG 11 talks a lot about housing but has insufficiently tackled the need for the homeless to access shelter. Target 11.1 states how crucial housing is to sustainable development. Yet informal settlements and other poor communities are facing the constant threat of evictions. How do we address that which is unrecognized? We need to put the issues at the front and center. We need to talk about evictions and street-connected children. To effectively fight for our rights, we also need to fight for recognition. Leave no issue behind.
The first part, I will just give a short background on the SDG 11, just to make sure that everyone will be on the same page, because some of us might not be that aware yet of the Sustainable Development Goals, or particularly SDG 11, but since we don't have enough time to discuss the Sustainable Development Goals, so we will at least try to give you an idea of SDG 11. Okay. So SDG 11, it's titled Sustainable Cities and Communities, and its objective is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals, aside from having that mission, also have targets. So for SDG 11, it actually has around 10 targets, but I will just be pointing out the targets which we think are more relevant in today's discussion. So they are targets 11.1, which is on safe and affordable housing, 11.3 on inclusive and sustainable urbanization, and 11.7, which provide access to safe and inclusive green and public spaces. So aside from targets, SDGs, including SDG 11, also have what we call indicators. So these are the measures that can be taken to see if the SDG is being achieved or how far we are from achieving these SDGs. So for SDG 11, for the targets that we have chosen, so for 11.1, there is the proportion of urban population living in slums, informal settlements, or inadequate housing. So this is one of the measurements that will be checked to monitor it. And then there's also, for inclusiveness and sustainability of urbanization, the ratio of land consumption rate to population rate. So how much land is being used compared to the number of people already residing in a specific area. And then the proportion of cities with direct participation, structure of civil society in urban planning and management. So this pertains to being inclusive in terms of giving space to the people, civil society in governance. And then lastly, for the access to safe and inclusive green and public space, there are two indicators. So the first one is the share of the built-up area cities, which is open for public use without any discrimination based on sex, age, disability, and other possible factors. And the last one is an indicator regarding physical or sexual harassment based on different factors, how much of these occur in the last 12 months. So this hopefully gives you an idea of what SDG 11 is and what it tries to achieve, and how it tries to measure this goal that it wants to achieve. So for the next part of the program, we would like to call our first one of the first speakers. Let's call on Miss Catherine Scarry. She is from the Consortium for Street Children, and she is also the executive director of Bahay Tuluyan, an children's rights organization based in the Philippines. And she will be talking about street-connected children, or children in street situations, and their relationship with the Sustainable Development Goal 11.
Thank you so much. Good evening to everybody, wherever we are in the world. Greetings from Manila. So I'm in Manila, as JP introduced. So firstly, disclaimer, the first thing I'll say is that I'm not an expert on SDG 11. I have had quite a bit of experience working with children in street situations. And so I will try and give some insight into how I think SDG 11 intersects with the needs and issues facing children in street situations. But given that it's a very short time frame, I'm not going to try and go into too much detail. But hopefully you'll have an oversight into the main issues. Okay, so just a very, very brief introduction to who we are. So I'm the Executive Director of Bahay Tuluyan. We have been working with CISS, is our acronym for Children in Street Situations, since 1987. We served as the Civil Society Chair for the Subcommittee for the Protection and Welfare of Children in Street Situations from 2018 to 2023. And as the co-chair of that committee, we helped to lead the development of the Philippines' first national multi-sectoral strategic plan for children in street situations. So this is a rights-based approach to trying to address the needs and issues of children in street situations. And Bahay Tuluyan, as JP mentioned, is a member of the Consortium for Street Children, which is an international network of organizations and interested individuals working on this issue. So there's more information at our website. But just to get straight into the concern, or I guess the topic for today, trying to understand the intersection. So the goal of SDG 11 is to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So I guess what we're trying to understand is, where do street children fit into this image of inclusive, resilient, safe, sustainable cities? So before we jump into that, I think it's important for us to understand who are children in street situations. And the definitions you can see here come from the general comment, UNCRC General Comment 21, which defines basically two groups of children. The first is children who depend on the streets to live and or work, whether alone, with peers, or with family. And secondly, a wider population of children who form strong connections with public spaces and for whom the street plays a vital role in their everyday lives and identities. So it's quite a diverse group. So we're not just talking about children who live on the street full time. We're not just talking about unaccompanied children. We're talking about families. We're talking about children for whom the street is their main go-to place, or the place where they spend their recreation time or their working time, or it's a very important part of their life and identity. And so I guess one of the overall statements that I'll make is that not achieving SDG 11 both pushes and pulls children onto the street. So basically, when we talk about CISS, we normally talk about the different push and pull factors in place. So the push factors can be and will continue to be, unless we address them, inadequate housing, lack of access to basic services, natural disasters, abuse and violence and unemployment. And then pull factors that are drawing children onto the street are economic opportunities, places to play, sleep and breathe, and connectedness, or a sense of community with their peers and other members of the community. So I think keeping in mind these push and pull factors is really important as we look. There's not one type of street child, or there's not one situation. So it's a very non-homogeneous group of children with varying forms of connection and needs on the street. So I guess basically what I'd like to share with you is what I see as the two main issues. The first is invisibility. So invisibility for children in street situations. And this is where they will fall through the cracks in SDG 11 unless we really make concerted efforts to make sure they don't. So there are different aspects of this invisibility. First is that at an individual level, CISS are not recognised by their local authorities. So this is in the Philippines often called dayuhan. So when we approach the local authorities for registration cards or documentation of different kinds, that's the local governments will say they're not from here. So they won't be recognised by their local authorities. Secondly, at a structural level, there is confusion over who is responsible for children in street situations. Are they a parking issue? Are they a law and order issue? Should it be the police? Should it be the social welfare department? And what we've really found in our work across this sector is that there is a lack of confusion. There is a lack of clarity in whose mandate it is to deal with these children. And that often means they fall through the cracks. And then thirdly, at a policy level, children in street situation are often overlooked. They don't necessarily fit into the more well-defined, well-recognised groups like children with disabilities, or in terms of gender frameworks. So children in street situations generally cross a whole lot of different sectors, and so they're not often included as a particular group that needs to be targeted. So that's what I would define as the first issue, the issue of invisibility. And then interestingly, the second issue that I would define is the issue of visibility. So the issue of visibility in relation to children in street situations is that their actual visibility on the street is often what triggers us. It's often what triggers people to make a response in the first place. And that can often lead to more harm for these children. So in different ways. So first, they can be what we tend to term the welfare approach. So the visibility of children on the street prompts a response of wanting to help these children, of wanting to do something, of wanting to remove them from the dangers on the street, which is not always a bad thing, but it can be implemented in ways that are detrimental to children. More often to be negative is what we would call a repressive approach. So the sight of children on the street is perceived as a threat, a blemish on society, something that needs to be removed to be cleaned up. So in thinking back to SDG 11 and our ideas of safe, inclusive, resilient cities, if there are visible children on the street that don't conform with our society norms of what children should be doing, then that can cause conflict. And then that links with the third point, that children in street situations do not necessarily fit our vision of an ideal childhood. So this impacts on our willingness to incorporate them and their needs into public spaces. So I think that one of the risks when we talk about goals and we envision a bright future is that it's hard for us to incorporate into that ideas that don't fit into our ideas of an ideal world. And the reality with children in street situations, we're not conceding to the fact that there always will be children in street situations, but the reality is that in most cities around the world there are. And so it is important that as we plan for our cities, that we make sure that these children still have space in the cities, so that not the only default option is not always just to remove them. So that's, I guess, the two overarching issues that I think overarch and underlie they intersect between CISS and SDGs. SDG 11. So just to give you, I guess, a more concrete example, or a couple of more concrete examples, I've just got two very short case studies that I want to share with you. So the first is in relation to 11.1, the target that JP mentioned earlier, which is that by 2030, there should be access for all to adequate, safe and affordable housing and basic services and upgrade slums. So it's fairly non-controversial. It makes a lot of sense. In trying to understand how this fits or relates to children in street situations, the connection is very clear. Inadequate or unaffordable housing is a key push factor, pushing children in street situations into those situations, pushing children into street situations. And once in those situations, or once children don't have adequate housing, once they become homeless, they are vulnerable to many other abuses and violations. So the impact is significant. Street children and families are often not in houses on a regular basis. So they don't get recognised for rehousing, for basic services. So yeah, I'll give you an example in a moment, but often our programs, like in the indicators that were mentioned earlier, you can see that they're linked to improving the housing of people who already have houses. But if you don't actually have a house to begin with, you're often not even recognised. And even more so for children who aren't connected to family. So unaccompanied children are very unlikely to be eligible for a government housing program. They might be eligible to be sheltered in a government shelter, but that doesn't provide them long-term housing solutions necessarily. And then even the UN definition of a slum doesn't normally include sidewalk dwelling, living in cemeteries, living in markets or plazas or under bridges. So there is really this whole sector of people who live, who are homeless or with insecure housing, who don't even fall into the programs aimed to capture them. So to give you that example of that, in the Philippines, the conditional cash transfer program aimed to target the poorest of the poor. And it did this through a household survey. So you can imagine how implicit in the idea of a household survey is the idea that street dwellers are automatically excluded because they don't live in households. So what happened then in the Philippines was that was eventually recognized by the government, and what evolved was the modified conditional cash transfer program for homeless street families. But you could see in the very first round of all the planning that went into the original program, homeless people weren't even considered, even though the program itself was aiming to target the poorest of the poor. And then I guess what some of the drawbacks of that program, that when it was eventually modified to meet the needs of the homeless population, there was limited interventions for this group. For example, they were given rental assistance, but for short periods of time. There was difficulties with tracking or supporting families over time. Many of the street families had difficulty with meeting the social inclusion burdens. So, for example, being able to secure the appropriate legal documents or bank accounts to be able to access the government support. And then often the risk of removal of benefits if the children were on the street. So this is also a risk for children and families under this program. So an imperfect solution. And I guess the idea here being that you can really see the invisibility issue. So just to show you some of the ways that the Philippine National Strategic Plan for CISS is aiming to address some of these issues. Firstly, to provide children on the street with informal identity cards so that they can overcome some of the barriers, the documentary barriers for accessing services. Improving access to civil registration, for example, getting birth certificates for children who are unregistered. And finally, the government has agreed to conduct a comprehensive review of existing housing and relocation policies to include children in street situations and their families in the priority sectors. So this for us is really important, that they can actually be factored into that kind of housing program. Okay, and then I'll just very briefly share with you one more case study, which relates to target 11.4. strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage, which is obviously a really important goal, a really important target, but has impact also on children in street situations. So the connection is that often those places that we're trying to protect are also the pull factors for CISS, for children in street situations. Sites of cultural heritage are tourist sites, and so children in need are attracted to those areas because of the economic opportunities. And so the impact of fulfilling this goal of protecting and safeguarding is that often this pushes children in street situations out. So once the area is beautified and it becomes a draw card for tourists, for visitors, then the presence of children in street situations becomes less and less desirable for many members of the community, and they get pushed out. And then what can also happen, either separately or at the same time, is that these spaces can become semi-privatized, even public spaces. So this can really lead to a kind of indirect discrimination where, for example, here in Manila, some of the biggest tourist attractions are often malls, and malls are private property, but they're semi-private in terms of they're really open to most people of the public most of the time. But through things like dress codes and security guards, children in street situations can continue to be excluded from those places, even without formal discriminatory policies in place. So just one example I wanted to give you, which is very local to us here at Bahay Tuluyan, is the example of Paraiso ng Batang Manila, a playground that was a very small playground, but it was a really important playground for children here in our area. Very run down, very dilapidated. And what the government decided to do was to convert part of it into a children's road safety park, which sounds like a great idea, good for children to be able to access. But what happened as they built the road safety park, they put up high fences with barbed wire, and they said that it was no longer available just for open access, but you had to secure a permit from the relevant government authority before you can access the park. So basically what happened was that the children no longer had, and not just children in street situations, but also every child in the area no longer had anywhere to go, and they still don't. And so that pushes them out of those public spaces. So what I was talking about is this de facto, sorry, there's a typo, privatization of public spaces through things like permits, guards, entrance fees, fences, and dress codes. And that's something I think we need to be very aware of as we try to move forward with the implementation of SDG 11. Just one more example is Luneta Park, which is a big park here in Manila. It's the biggest in the city of Manila. Same thing happens. It's open to the public, but we have direct personal experience of being excluded from that when by security guards, private security guards, who perceive that the children in street situations are not a good fit for the public space. And obviously public green spaces in very densely populated cities like Manila are very, very important. So again, under the National Strategic Plan for Children in Street Situations, there are some attempts to remove some of the stigma, to make sure that children don't experience this kind of discrimination, and that the national parks and development committees are oriented to make sure that they make these public spaces available for children in street situations. So I guess the summary and what I'd like to end with is that if we want to really effectively implement SDG 11, we need to make sure that we address both the issues of visibility and invisibility of children in street situations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for that very informative and very concrete discussion of the situation of children in street situations and how important they are to be considered to be able to achieve this sustainable development in general, and even particularly SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities. So we hope that our audience have also seen how important these children are as actually a measurement of how we are reaching because I remember from an earlier side event that we actually attended. So they mentioned that children in the slums are actually in like the worst situation. But I was actually thinking that maybe not as bad as those in street situations, because as Catherine has mentioned, even they don't even have identity cards, and they don't even have they don't even qualify for some programs of the government because of that issue on their residence. So there's still a lot to learn, and this is, I hope, just a start for all of us. So we hope to have more opportunities learning about children in street situations. But before we get into that, we'll head now to our next speaker. But before we do that, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm JP Lapid. I'm the Deputy Director of the Association for the Rights of Children in Southeast Asia. So for our next speaker, we have our guest, Tekanat, from the Montfort Social Institute. So he'll be discussing effects of Sustainable Development Goal 11 in relation to evictions and homelessness.
Friends, I come from Montfort Social Institute, Hyderabad. I also the coordinator of the International Alliance of Inhabitants. Montfort Social Institute work in 12 different cities and towns in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana of South India. We work with the domestic workers. We have 2 trade unions. We have the Slum People's Federation in 2 cities. We work with the transgender community, and we work with children through inclusive children's parliaments in the slums. I intend to talk to you on evictions, but in the context of India, and how that impacts children. As we know, evictions and the impact of children is not really dealt with directly in the SDGs. Now, how do we bring that into the programs of the SDGs and the ambit of the SDGs? This, I think, is a challenge. Now, India is an extremely contrasting country. It's 1,400 million people that live in this country. 30% of the population in the country live in cities and towns. Around 30% of this population live in slums. Well, this is one aspect or one phase of India, but there is another phase to India, and that's can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, and this is the other side of the urban context in India. These are slums, these are garbage dump yards, extremely poor situations, housing in which a large population in this country live. The next slide. In fact, I do not really intend to go into how the UNCRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Children, but then it does talk about, Article 27 does talk about that every child has to be given a standard of living that is adequate for the child's physical, mental, spiritual, and moral and social development. This is a responsibility of the state and the state parties that and in India India has ratified the convention, and India is bound to follow it. The next slide. Now SDG we have already seen. Again, SDG 1.4 talks about to ensure that all people have access to adequate and affordable housing and basic services. It recognizes the importance of access to adequate housing and highlights the need to address forced evictions and other forms of housing insecurity. SDG 11 We just saw what SDG 11 has to tell us. Also, SDG 16, it talks about peace, justice, and strong institutions that would protect all citizens, but much more so children. Next slide. Also, the Constitution of India, all the rights, fundamental rights that the Constitution of India talks about are rights linked to the protection and guarantee of the human rights to adequate housing and land, and the fundamental rights often the Supreme Court of India and other higher judiciary has interpreted to show that children have a right to be protected. And housing in India is not a fundamental right, but India has ratified UN conventions that talks about right to life is also right to housing. The next slide. Yeah, one thing that is happening in the name of development, the current government came to power with the promise of development for all. And in the name of development, there's a huge number of evictions that are taking place, particularly in the recent past. I will tell you what it in the last 3-4 years, what has happened. In the name of development, in the name of large projects, there is urban renewal and expansion of our cities and towns, in the name of city beautification, sports and other mega events that the country organizes, industrial development, and just land grabbing, because real estate values have shot up in the last few years. Privatization of the public goods, environmental conservation projects, and well, there are many issues that we have to that forces children onto the streets. Catherine was talking about children, and this is how often children come to the streets or have nowhere to be. Next slide. Just to tell you how the situation of housing in India, over 4 million people are homeless. In other words, 4 million people who live on the streets of India. And at least 75 million people live in informal settlements in urban areas without access to basic amenities such as essential services, including water and sanitation. Just to give you an idea of what that means, over 36,486 houses were demolished. This was in 2021. And this is during the COVID year, where there was a very stricture from the UN saying that no eviction should take place during this period of disaster. At least 207,106 people were forcibly evicted during that year. At least 158 incidents of forced evictions were reported. Nearly 15 million people are currently living under the threat of eviction and displacement. In other words, 15 million people in this country live under constant threat of eviction, of displacement. We are told that at least 100 houses are demolished every day, and that is the type of evictions, displacements that happen. Next slide. This is just to show you some major incidents of forced evictions in 2022, and this is just 6 months. From January to July reveals that state authorities across the country demolished 25,800 homes, affecting almost over 100,000 people being evicted. Next. This is an overview of forced evictions in India from 2017 to 2021. if you look at 2017, that is pre-COVID, 53,791 houses were demolished, affecting 258,196 people. In 2018, 41,734 houses were demolished, affecting 202,233 people. And in 2019, 22,247 houses were demolished, affecting 107,625. So just to show you even how during the very thick of COVID, large number of evictions took place. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. And now, how does it impact children? Evictions impact children. I can tell hundreds of stories to you. Children are extremely vulnerable, become extremely vulnerable when evictions happen. Even as they are born or even before birth, there are poor birth outcomes that happen because the stress, lack of access to basic health facilities that is necessary, the environmental hazards. Now, I remember eviction happening in the thick of the monsoon season, pouring rain, people, a mother giving birth to a child in the pouring rain outside on the street after an eviction taking place, malnutrition, disruption of schooling. I know hundreds of thousands of children who leave the school when evictions happen and they never come back to the school. Increased stress and anxiety. Children show extreme stress and anxiety symptoms, innumerable health problems, simply because they don't have a room or a house to protect them. The emotional trauma that they go through when bulldozers come and demolish the little houses that they have. Children are so malnutritioned and their overall growth gets stunted. Increased risk of exploitation, especially girl children being exploited, being trafficked. Trafficking happens, increases manifold increase in trafficking that happens of especially young girls and adolescent girls. Disruption of the social networks because they are dispersed. The relationships that they had been building over the years as children, as youth, as adults, these get totally disrupted. Maternal depression that impacts children because mothers and often parents go into depression when their houses are demolished, and that impacts children extremely. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. Now, in terms of recommendations, now there is tremendous stress, tremendous impact on children that happens. But as I said, SDGs, as we have it now, does not seriously adequately address children in the context of evictions. We have been asking for a zero eviction strategy from the governments, that no evictions happen, and if evictions have to happen for emergency situations, give them facilities and housing that is better than what they have to lose out. These are UN guidelines that we already have, and we have been insisting these with the states, that the governments, both at the central government, the federal level, and in the regions at the state level, actually implement these. The government must seriously assess the impact of the large number of evictions. See, especially during the evictions that happened during the COVID period, that has led to the death of hundreds of children in India. Hundreds of parents in India, they were thrown into the open with so little to protect them, especially when the COVID attacks became so rampant. And it is during that period that a number of evictions that took place. And we have been asking that the government must assess the impact of such evictions that happened during the COVID period, and must compensate, must take remedial measures for it. The state must follow international and domestic law in ensuring adequate housing for all. Well, there are big promises. There is supposed to have been, see, in the urban areas, officially, there is a lack of, there is a shortage of 18 million houses. And we were promised by that 2022, all of them will receive adequate housing. But this still remains a dream that is to be achieved, perhaps, I don't know, after how many decades more. So this is the context in which I'm talking about a typical case of India. In the city that I live in is Hyderabad, and such stories can be narrated from different cities in India. So I think it is important that such a dialogue is happening, and evictions is something that we must stop. We have been campaigning for zero evictions and the right of people to the cities, and these rights include the rights of children, and this is something that we must continue to campaign for. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Fergus, for giving a comprehensive look at the situation of the marginalized in India, not only in your city, but actually the whole country, which is, of course, one of the largest countries in the world, and would really exemplify the situation of urban cities all over the globe. And what's striking is that in the evictions, even during the pandemic, the number of evictions, houses affected, and the individuals affected didn't seem to be prevented by the pandemic. So it's really something that is serious, that has to be addressed by the governments and also by the Sustainable Development Goals, so that it can genuinely achieve its objective for development for everyone. So for now, we will now go to our next speaker from the UN Habitat. We have Tam Huang, who is a Sustainable Urbanization Specialist from the UN Habitat Bangkok Program Office. So you have the floor, Tam.
Thanks so much for that, JP. Just wanted to say, firstly, props to JP, and it's a shame we couldn't meet here, but thanks for inviting UN Habitat to this session. Of course, very grateful to the Association for the Rights of Children in Southeast Asia and Kadame for coordinating the event with partners here. And it was so my role here is to offer some reflection. I sit within the regional office for Asia and the Pacific here with UN Habitat, and we've been coordinating the SDG 11 review process as well as the goal profile here at the Asia Pacific Forum for Sustainable Development. So firstly, I'm thrilled to see the analysis and the content that's clearly visible through the work that's being led, of course, both by CSC and Bahai Tulian, I think, Catherine. I also think I picked up a bit of maybe an Aussie accent there as well, and also from Montefort Social Institute as well. So I think in the spaces that we are sitting here at the Asia Pacific Forum for Sustainable Development, it certainly is valuable to bring to the core some of the indicators that are relevant. I think what's valuable to perhaps consider in this space around children, let's say at the edge, and that are most vulnerable is beyond just the housing issues. I think that'd be important to look into. Of course, the issues around SDG 6 are also being assessed at the moment in this particular round. And as we know, during COVID, waste and sanitation programs, particularly for preventative measures, was very challenging for those that are informal settlements. We visited and supported the setup of water points at transit stations. We were looking at how to provide and support for COVID-19 measures within homeless shelters, and it was virtually impossible because there was no space. There was no segregation. In fact, access to clean water was a challenge before COVID. So going into COVID, sanitation just became more difficult. So I think these issues are quite pertinent, and in many ways they provide entry points to have this other discussion around housing and land tenure, which can often be a bit more contentious. So coming in from that access to services angle can often be very valuable in having the discussion with municipality or other partners as you're exploring that further as well. So commend, of course, the strong data content, which is to convey the severity of the issues. We heard there from MSI about the 15 million living in threat of evictions, displacement, 4 million homeless, and that's just in India, right? So in the region, we know there's 600 million slum dwellers across both Southeast and South Asia. And at the same time, at a global level, about 1.6 billion people that still live within conditions of inadequate housing. So it's a challenge, and it has been a persistent challenge. I don't think that it will be resolved anytime soon. Interestingly, we led the SDG 11 Goal Profile, which will be presented in the roundtable tomorrow for those that are here in Bangkok and joining in for that session. And the suggestion, which I have to admit, at a personal level, I would dispute, is that the suggestion is that we will reach our target in terms of urban slum populations by 2030, right? Now, the question that I would pose there to the participants in our forum here today is to, what is our definition then of a slum population, which obviously changes. And if the definition changes, then it's very easy for government to get away and suggest that they're meeting their needs, right? And secondly, in what areas? Because inevitably, as we have development, there will always be pockets of informality, and there will be communities that will be potentially left behind. And those that are coming into new cities and areas, migrants and perhaps stateless persons that are vying for economic, livelihood, and education opportunities will often be at the fringes as well. So, so as I said, my personal view is I question that, and I encourage you, if you are joining for the roundtable tomorrow from the Urban Poor Consortium and coalition constituencies, to raise these points, right? Because the suggestion right now in terms of statistics is that we'll meet those targets by 2030, and they don't take into account that population may potentially grow by 2030, which is another dimension that we need to consider as well. I think, Catherine, you already highlighted very well around the issues, the cascading impacts that link to those particularly children being at risk of being victims themselves of physical and sexual harassment. And of course, it's a perpetual cycle as well, right? So if you're, this comes to the discussion about the household family unit. So the values that you have growing up, if you have that family and social network that can support you, but if you inherently grow up in a society where you are victimized, that you are harassed and abused, when you grow up, then, you carry some of those emotional, discrimination and concerns with you that can lead to a perpetual cycle and be very hard to break out of as well. So I think what we need to be able to strive to do in this context, when we're considering particularly the needs of children, is look at what we can, I would suggest, consider as pathways to prosperity that allow for the children that are in these circumstances to obtain and develop opportunities for sustained education and support to attend school, and not then be spending their times in precarious potential family support occupations or other hazardous risk taking endeavors as well. So I think these are some things that we need to take into account when we consider these areas well. I was really fascinated, I have to say, by some of what you were sharing there, Catherine, as well as I guess around the permits, guards, and fences. And I think you referred to as permits, guards, and fences, I think, Catherine, and I guess around city beautification, sports events, and environment conservation, I noted down. So it's interesting because so often municipalities, and we see these as positive development, right? We think, this is going to bring economic growth and prosperity to the city. We're seeing greenification of cities, but it can be, as you said, camouflaged and leading to this eviction and you know, they may say, oh look, you know, you're only temporarily out for, you know, this period of time, but then, as you said, the fences go up, and then the land is then taken away, and it's very hard to kind of retrieve that back again. So I think, you know, again, this is something to consider, and I think we need to reflect upon it more within the discussion on SDG 11 here at APSFD, but also in New York in July at HUPF, and thinking about what we consider as development now, but then what would be the impacts on which communities and in what way, right? So I think this is a really valuable point that you raised around how we address permits and bylaws and the regulatory mechanisms that guard our social protection and welfare systems as well. So really interesting points there. I just wanted to share. I also noted, just to share, of course, this year is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We heard many human rights instruments, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, and other, the Article 27 under the CRC. So, you know, use this year as a platform to campaign as part of the urban poor constituency for these issues around access to services. And when I've discussed with colleagues from UNICEF on issues around provision of services, particularly around children, it was clearly the most evident area that we could move upon. And also in many respects, areas that donors and member states can see quite visibly where the impacts are. I think my closing is very much related to that as well, in what I want to share as a quick reflection, in that what we need to be able to convey in forums, particularly these heavily policy oriented and, let's face it, top down, you know, hierarchical processes, is we need to bring the message from the bottom up in terms of what the reality of the impacts are, and in particular what the actual cost is to productivity, right? I mean, when we have these children that are impacted in the ways they are, whether it's due to malnutrition, inadequate housing, it's a lost generation of productivity. It's you know, lives that are irreversibly harmed and have very little opportunity to really grow and reach that potential that could support you know, growth and development within the country, and as a byproduct of that, unfortunately, does often lead to issues of social ills and potential crime, as was shared earlier as well. So I think what we need to be able to convey is, you know, what is the potential for growth if we had imagined, right, 1 million young people that now were fully engaged, educated, informed, that knew what rights they had, and actively contributed to the development of the nation, right? So to be able to show that is something that may help incentivize and help the municipalities see this as, rather than a burden they have to manage, but an opportunity that they can cultivate and help bring into the fore. So the more we can do that, I think the more that the message will carry across. And as UN Habitat in our endeavor, we continue to support the work of the urban poor and informal communities. And we look forward to working closely with the constituents here for our forums that will be coming up, including the Asia Pacific Urban Forum in October in Korea, as well as our World Urban Forum in Egypt in Cairo in January. So looking forward to seeing you there. And thank you once again for the opportunity to contribute today. Many thanks. Back to you, JP.
Thank you very much, Sam, for that very many inputs, actually. The notes that you took of the points that we have raised are highly appreciated. And we're actually glad that you even gave us some suggestions on how we can continue and forward these messages that we want to put across with the United Nations and even with our governments. So it's very important that we actually have the UN Habitat now to also give us insights on this. So we now go to our next part, which is the open forum. So people can ask questions or maybe raise some suggestions also on how we can move forward with these concerns that we have regarding the children in street situations and evictions and homelessness, especially in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals and SDG 11. So I've seen some comments in the chat, so maybe you would want to also share it. We also have, it's also nice that we have a good mix of people in our in this meeting. So we have, of course, people from the civil society organizations, not only working on children or on urban poor, but I think several interests. Then we also have people from the United Nations, aside from TAM, and also some people from the diplomatic community. So it's hopefully we can get a more comprehensive perspective too, based on this different backgrounds that we have in today's meeting. So anyone who would like to ask a questions or make a manifestation, you can raise your hand, or for those who want to just put your questions or comments in the chat box, then I can read them. So while we're waiting, maybe I can read some of the comments. We have one comment from Joy from Bangladesh. So she says that like water management in slum areas, there's community approach. Like that, the local authority can make a list with the support of the local elected bodies. And based on that, they can provide support. So many of them are not voters or legal inhabitants of that slum areas, which is actually one of the things that actually serves as a barrier, as explained by our speakers. But statistics can be made with the help of local bodies, CSOs and NGOs and local authorities. Regarding evictions, there are national resettlement policies for every countries, and also international resettlement policies of the IFIs, or the funding institutions or companies. It's necessary to follow the policies, though in perspective of human rights. Yes, of course. What's good about Joy's point is actually you can see the value of partnerships between different stakeholders like local elected bodies, CSOs, NGOs, and since we're talking about communities, it's also important to mobilize community-based organizations, women's organizations, children's and youth organizations. And then, of course, these should all be put into perspective of human rights, especially as Tam mentioned, this year will be the 75th year of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So it's actually a big opportunity to raise various concerns, since all the concerns are essentially concerns of human rights also. I will just give some idea of what we have planned to do to move forward with these issues or concerns. So in the next few, for this year, since as they've mentioned, we plan to raise these concerns, particularly at least for the UN Habitat, since they are taking the lead with SDG 11. So we hope to have a dialogue with UN Habitat to on how we can probably make sure that these conversations take place, especially since unfortunately these particular issues and concerns and sectors are not clearly articulated in the actual SDG text. So it is necessary for us to actually put them on the table for them to be tackled. So we hope that to have that conversation, to continue the conversation we had with TAM, with the UN Habitat. And we also plan to reach out to other global regions, hopefully, because definitely these issues are not only here in Asia and the Pacific. For our part, for ARCSEA, we plan to have another online event. We're still finalizing if it will be just a local event here in the Philippines, or again, at least an Asia or Southeast Asia event, particularly on children in street situations, since April 12 is also the International Day for street-connected children. And also, we'll be having follow-up activities on this as part of the Human Rights 75 celebration.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for that. No, and just to begin with some of the campaigns and the schedule. So, like JP said, October for the International Alliance of Inhabitants is traditionally a zero eviction month. No, it's Habitat Month, but it's also zero eviction month. So that means there are a series of campaigns and activities, discussions, and mobilizations revolving around the issue of adequate housing. And of course, the issue of the persistent eviction still happening around the world and in the Asia Pacific, as we've been talking about and sharing in this webinar. No, but yes, I think it's everybody. I think it's just we should watch out for that. No, But at the same time, just to synthesize, there's already a lot has been said, and Pam also actually synthesized quite a few points when he spoke, and he offers a very optimistic view. But I think for me, it's great to hear that institutions like UN Habitat are really listening to the people and to movement-based initiatives. No? Just to recap a little bit, what we discussed today, and add to what the speakers have already shared. No, like JP said earlier, there are a number of the indicators that constitute SDG 11, and I would say that there's still a lot of discussion and debate on this. But at its core, all of us are looking for cities that cater to them looking for cities to cater to democratic rights and make livable spaces. Inclusive, safe, and resilient, I think, is just another way of saying democratic, just, and pro-poor. And when we went into Catherine's discussion, no, about children in street situations, and I think there is a commonality also between her discussion and that of Varghese, in that there is a general policy of exclusion leveled against marginalized peoples. There's a policy of exclusion and different varying levels of invisibility from slums and streets, and children, men and women, and all kinds of people who live in these precarious situations being deprived of their basic rights inside cities which are supposedly supposed to address this in various forms. No? And despite the introduction of SDGs, evictions have actually been globally increasing in frequency and in form. And we saw this also with the point made by Varghese that the pandemic actually was sort of a springboard for more forms of exploitation and deprivation of rights to take place. Many of our policymakers and officials will talk of cities, green cities, and all of these trigger words that are touting sort of the future of urban spaces. But more and more people are pushed away from their homes, away from the formal economy, and away from society at large, as though they were living. It's as though people are living a parallel existence where their rights do not apply. I think the case of India, like Varghese was saying, is also very massive and significant. It teaches us about what evictions look like as an indicator of what evictions can look like all over the Asia Pacific. No? And also, to go back to Catherine, of course, children in street situations are among the most vulnerable and overlooked in these kinds of situations and crises. To sum up also the recommendations, there are three, I would say, to continue the call for adequate housing, to address post-pandemic recovery and not greater deprivation, and of course, more concretely, to ensure that the issues of children in street situations, to ensure that the issues of slum dwellers and urban poor over the Asia Pacific are included in the official processes of our nations, the United Nations, and other country level and regional level. No? I think personally, there is this, many of our policymakers have this neoliberal ethic of thinking that systems and policies will sort themselves out. And that's what they teach to a lot of people. But in fact, the reality is that the structures in place are looking to deprive people of, or have been depriving people of, their basic needs. And these problems will not fix themselves. The need for recognition of these issues is of prime importance, and it will be a disservice to all of us if these matters continue to be left behind.
Okay. Thank you, Michael, for synthesizing our discussion now. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for attending, and we hope that we can meet you again in our other engagements and meetings on these topics and other topics.